comes down to whether that is commercial off-the-shelf software, proprietary, because, if the government is purchasing your software and you're developing it specifically for the government, under the DFARS, they have technical rights to the data. So when the government funds your development, they get rights to the data. And there's different types of rights. There's kind of unlimited rights, there's limited rights, and they're limited in different ways based on the contract and the contract officer negotiation, right?
Welcome to It's Fine, the podcast where we jump into the intricacies of technology and policy shaping our world, brought to you by Hunter Strategy. This week, we're exploring a topic at the heart of cybersecurity and national defense, the FedRAMP Equivalence requirement recently clarified by the Department of Defense Chief Information Officer for cloud vendors eager to supply the defense industrial base. With the landscape of cybersecurity constantly evolving, these requirements are more crucial than ever before for companies aiming to operate with defense sector especially. To shed light on the complex subject, we're thrilled to introduce our special guest, Alex Trafton, the Senior Managing Director from Ankura Consulting. Alex brings a wealth of knowledge and expertise in cybersecurity and cloud computing, having navigated the intricacies of regulatory compliance and strategic consulting for organizations operating in sensitive critical sectors. His insights into FedRAMP equivalence will not only clarify these changes mean, but also explore implication for cloud vendors and the defense ecosystem as a whole. Join us as we dive into the nuances of these regulations, understand their impact on industry, and learn how companies can navigate the sector effectively. Whether you're a cloud vendor, a cybersecurity enthusiast, or someone in the intersection of technology and defense, this discussion promises to be enlightening. Welcome, Alex.
Thanks, Matt. Good to be here.
So, and for those that are learning about this memo the first time coming into this discussion, a few months ago, DoD clarified, or DoD CIO clarified what FedRAMP equivalence was. Do you think you could start by giving your overview of what those requirements were and why these changes we think are so impactful?
Yeah, so I think we really have to start at the center of gravity for cybersecurity requirements for defense contractors. And so in 2010, the Biden administration issued this CUI, the Controlled Unclassified Information Executive Order, which required agencies to start developing this classification of data that wasn't classified, needed to be shared, but still needed to be protected, right? And so the agencies went out to go and do this and to make a rule and to do all of the things that the federal government does. And they issued a final rule in 32 CFR. And the first agency to kind of extend these protection requirements outside of the agency was the DoD. The DoD in 2013 went through rulemaking and issued the first DFARS 252, 204, 7012 contract clause, which laid out protection requirements for CUI. And that was a subset of controls from NIST 853. At the same time, NIST created Special Publication 80171, which is protecting CUI and non-federal organizations. Those two married up, and the DFARS 7012 was updated to include 80171 as a requirement for defense contractors. So that's been in place since 2017. The clause also calls out a broader segment of what is adequate security for federal contractors to the DoD when they process, store, transmit covered defense information, which is what the DoD calls all of its types of CUI. There's 4 types of DoD CUI. Controlled technical information is the one that most of the defense contractors will be dealing with. There's also stuff that relates to nuclear energy and things like that. And so this adequate security standard is where 80171 lives. Now, this is pretty much the clause that every defense contractor gets because contracting officers throw that in the contract as just a default, right? There's instructions on how contract clauses get put into contracts for contract officers, and it's very broad. So most contractors get this. Now, in that adequate security section, there's also a section that addresses the use of cloud computing because the DoD understood that many of these defense contractors are using all kinds of cloud products, right? And the logic on CUI was the DoD is required to protect it by statute, right, or by executive order. right? They give it to the defense contractor. They are at no lower level required to protect that data. The government is still required to make sure the data is protected. So it extends logically that if they then put it in a cloud environment, that cloud environment must meet certain security standards, right? So what they stated was that the cloud product would need to meet FedRAMP moderate baseline, authorization or equivalency, right? And equivalency wasn't defined, right? They just said it needed to be equivalent. And the logic for that is CUI in the US government is classified as moderate impact. And so for those that are familiar with the RMF, the NIST RMF, that federal information systems to hold CUI must have a moderate baseline authorization, or a cloud product must have a FedRAMP moderate authorization. So once it went to the contractor, they said, well, they're not a federal entity, so we're going to tailor the special publication from NIST 800-171 and take out all of these federal requirements, and things don't relate to confidentiality because we don't care about the availability of their systems, right? But once it goes back into the cloud, well, now we need it to be FedRAMP moderate, right? So this was ambiguous for a long time. The DFARS clause went through several updates. In 2019, they updated it to include two supplementary clauses, 7019 and 7020, that related to self-assessments and uploading of SPRS scores and summary scores of their compliance with 800-171, and also assigned contractual rights to the DCMA, the Defense Contract Management Agency, and their auditing arm, DIBCAC, to audit certain companies on their compliance. That DFARS 7012 clause on FedRAMP moderate equivalency didn't change. They issued the initial CMMC cybersecurity maturity model certification proposed rule that got withdrawn. They've now reissued that. When you look in the CMMC rule and you look in the CMMC assessment guidance, it requires these third-party auditors to also evaluate whether the cloud systems that are being used by federal contractors, defense contractors, are FedRAMP moderate, authorized, or equivalent. Now, what does equivalent mean? Companies were saying, well, they have an ISO 27001 cert. They're SOC 2 certified. Everything's good. Well, I think that, in the course of these DCMA audits, it was discovered that not everybody was using cloud products that were equivalent. So the DoD issued this memo, which basically gave that very strict definition of what equivalency means. And it's set to kind of upend a lot of how defense contractors are using cloud services.
So a couple of thoughts. First, I think that I almost feel like it was intentional that they did not clarify what that moderate equivalency was. Mm-hmm. And I go back to FedRAMP's charter, which is to authorize between 12 and 15. I think it's 12 or 15. I don't remember what number, but that's how many new systems that they're funded to bring in a year from a JAB authorization perspective. Forget agency auths. There's other ways into FedRAMP. But that's less than 0.5% of systems that probably want to be able to be used by the government. And that's just on the vendor side. Okay, let's assume there's less of a demand internally than there's a desire to sell. That's still, 5% of the systems the government probably wants available a year. So by 2040, we should have all of those systems available in FedRAMP at this current rate. And that's assuming that the market stays static and no new cloud services become available, because that's usually our experience. So it almost felt to me like they were there was this wink of just do the right thing, work with the right companies, make sure that we're on their way to FedRAMP moderate and they can prove to you that they were. What do you feel like was the catalyst that kind of got them to clarify? Was it that they just waited too long in ambiguity? Defense contractors weren't doing the right thing? Where do you think that kind of pushed such a, I don't want to say it was a harsh interpretation. I think it was actually a relatively predictable interpretation. But why did they do it so quickly and when they did it?
So a few points come to mind. I mean, the first on FedRAMP, right? So to have a FedRAMP authorization with an agency, you need an agency customer. A lot of the cloud services that defense contractors are using won't have an agency customer. CAD CAM software, things that are development manufacturing related, the government's not manufacturing things, right? So I think there was an understanding that ultimately that there weren't going to be enough FedRAMP authorized products, to your point, just not only because of the scope and scale, but the authority of FedRAMP. right? The authority of FedRAMP is a risk and management and authorization process for federal agency acquisition. And we're really talking about non-federal agency acquisition of cloud products. I think the other thing is that my guess is, right, and I don't have any particular evidence to suggest this, is that what the DIBCAC was doing was saying, okay, you've got these cloud products, show us the body of evidence that shows they meet FedRAMP. And someone came back with a body of evidence, and DIBCAC said, well, it's not good enough. And they said, well, prove it's not good enough in the contract language, right? Because it says equivalent. What does that mean? And it's not defined in the definition of terms in the contract clause. And so there may have been litigation. There may have just been a tense exchange. But I think the reaction from DoD is driven by a few things. One is to define it. And two is to tighten up the risk management of that, right? Because when you do an authorization with an agency, right, the agency authorizing official can say, you have so many controls implemented, you have these POAMs, we're looking at what the risk to the data is. We can accept the risk of unimplemented controls with POAMs, right? But when a contractor is using a system, the agency isn't able to manage that risk. They're not able to evaluate which controls are implemented, which aren't, which can be POAMs, which can't, what are the remediation timelines. So what they've always done is set that risk tolerance in advance. 800-171 is a great example. They said, this is the minimum we'll tolerate with respect to risk. You have to do all of it. There's no accepting unimplemented controls. And I think that's exactly the logic they carried over and said, in this FedRAMP equivalency memo, there is no opportunity for POAM. They need to provide a body of evidence that shows they meet all the controls, because the agency is not there to make that judgment on risk to the systems, right? So I think that's what drove this FedRAMP memo, in which friends of mine in the industry were saying they've kind of nuked everyone from orbit, because, as you guys know, FedRAMP is an extremely difficult and costly process, right? And there's no allowance for deviation from the control baseline, where there is in FedRAMP. This memo doesn't allow that. So it's really almost a more stringent standard, because there's no opportunity to go to an agency official and say, well, here are the things we're still working on. And the agency can go, okay, we appreciate that. Keep working on them. Finish them in 6 months. We'll authorize the product. So this is actually a far more stringent standard, which is going to be really difficult for the defense industrial base.
I'm curious your interpretation, because I might have read it a little differently, and you're definitely better at reading these memos than I am, which is to say, you're right. When you have a FedRAMP, you can have POAMs, and you can't really tailor the baseline, but you can have delays in control implementation and mitigating controls and other things in between. First of all, that has created all kinds of fun problems, because nobody understands cloud inheritance, and people are claiming inheritance from controls that are in fact POAMs. But that's not the issue we're going to talk about. But what they said was that they actually allow you to have a POAM list in this. You're right. In fact, you're required to have a POAM list in this FedRAMP equivalency memo, and that has to be adjudicated by your C3PAO. So does that mean that in your mind you have to have that POAM list, but it has to be empty, and you can't have any open POAMs? Is that kind of your reading what the memo says?
So POAMs can be unimplemented controls. They could also be system vulnerabilities as you go through and do vulnerability scanning. So POAMs is a broader topic than just probably unimplemented controls. So correct that the memo does state that the 3PAOs will accept a POAM list, but the memo also states that all POAM actions must be corrected and validated by the 3PAO as closed. So there's actually a requirement that when you submit a body of evidence for FedRAMP moderate equivalency, that's evaluated by that FedRAMP 3PAO. So what the DoD is doing is saying they're kind of by this memo defining this equivalency standard in the contract, giving authority to the 3PAOs to serve as their oversight, right?
And so almost it's like not risk acceptance. They've almost like delegated a degree of risk acceptance to the 3PAO.
Yeah.
And it's an interesting mix, because it feels like they can't say it this way, but it feels like they mandated FedRAMP ready plus Kanban.
Yes.
Right. That's effectively what it feels like came out of it from what. And again, I'm just trying to reduce it to terms that people that are in the FedRAMP orbit kind of understand.
So that's right. So the POAMs, right, if they're operational, they have to be closed, and the 3PAO has to validate them. Now, the CSPs are allowed to have operational POAMs that are not a result of the 3PAO assessment. So that's going to be minor issues around vulnerabilities, or like we need to close the port on the firewall. So the control isn't implemented, right? Because you can implement a control and you can have a deviation in, right? So we block, certain ports, right, at the firewall, right? And you can have one of those ports open. You're like, oh, well, we need to close that. Well, it's not that you're not implementing the control, right? It's that you need to have a POAM to kind of clean that up, right? And so there's that level of discretion for the 3PAO. Now, if you were to say, well, I don't have an incident response plan, right? Like that's not going to fly.
Sure.
So I think that the POAMs are allowed at the operational level, and if they're not related to the assessment, but at the assessment level, the controls need to be implemented, all of them, right? For
even if they're partially implemented effectively, is what you're saying, or implemented with gaps, maybe as opposed to partially.
And I think again, there's ambiguity. Like every time the government makes a regulation, as we know, cybersecurity is incredibly detailed, right? Do I need every single system to be deployed with a STIG baseline to be compliant with secure baseline requirements? Or can I have one that's not? Like, what are the compensating controls, right? So there's a lot of discretion for the 3PAOs there, I think. But in the end of the day, I think if you look at the major controls and the major control families and you look at the enhancements, like those need to be implemented, right? Or there needs to be a compensating control in place that the 3PAO judges is satisfying the intent of the original control. But again, you're going to be allowed to have POAMs because theoretically the POAM process manages everything. Like I discovered a vulnerability. It's a high vulnerability. Under my policy, I remediate that in 60 days or 30 days or whatever it is. I think those things are going to be allowed in the POAMs while the controls probably won't be. But again, like leaves a lot of discretion to the 3PAOs, right? And by design, right? Because the DoD kind of, if you look at the history of this, they've just kind of not wanted to address the responsibility. They created the CMMC to have a third-party group audit. They've kind of said this is somebody else's responsibility. Like, and they don't talk about it a lot. They issue these memos. They're not always that detailed, and I think they try to push that out. So they're not accepting the risk of making those judgment calls. Because a lot of time, I think for good reasons, they're not qualified to understand your systems. They're not qualified to audit your systems, right?
There's a very limited number of people in DoD that have that level of qualification, and the majority of them work for DIBCAC, and they've got their dance card full until 2030 with assessments they had scheduled under the old rules. So
yes,
I think it was smart of them to bring in industry, but I do think that it has created this interesting interwoven kind of concept because industry can accept some risk.
Right.
To your point, operational things like STIGs and whatever. You might find a C3PAO that's like, oh, you don't have an incident response plan, but all of your, you have a moderate level baseline, but by definition, all of your data is public, right? You're a public research cloud tool that publishes everything, and your confidentiality is low for everything because that's just your concept. So we're going to accept that. I could see a C3PAO accepting that. And that's, to your point, kind of counter to what the memo is really asserting. And I don't know that any security organization, if they got to that level of an assessment, which I doubt they ever would, they would get the body of evidence and see that it was adjudicated with the stamp and probably move on. But if they did, I don't know that they would say that that's the wrong interpretation that C3PAO did. But I also don't think that it's actually complies with the memo. So it's an interesting problem to say the least.
Well, I think the other thing is that for a long time, across industry. So you name the industry, and not even cybersecurity, where the government has kind of said this is a market issue. Like, we're not going to regulate the market here. The market will make decisions on risk. You look at financial markets, right? How volatile they were until the government started inputting, Dodd-Frank and other kind of rules. And cybersecurity is no different. That if you leave industry to make judgments on risk, they're incentivized to prioritize profit, especially when they have shareholders, right? Like that's how they are judged as CEOs and CFOs. And so the issue has been that when you leave industry to make the risk decision, they have competing and perverse incentives when it comes to managing cyber risk. And I think that if you look at the audit reports from DoD and you look at the mass exfiltration of data to China from the defense industrial base, I think they've just come to the conclusion that like industry can't manage this risk. Like we have to manage it, and we can't do it on a case by case basis. So we just have to set the low water mark. And so 800-171 is the low watermark for non-federal systems, and this memo will set the low watermark for their cloud providers. And I don't think the DoD is going to be very interested in having any discussions about how to modify that. And they're just going to say you're going to need to do it as a condition of playing the game. And I think it's probably a good thing when you look at the criticality of the data that's going missing.
One thing that and I have a little graphic I'm going to share here, but one thing that I found is that customers that work with Hunter come to me and say, where do I fit? Do I need to be FedRAMP equivalent? What am I? And so I tried to come up with the visual here, and I'm curious as to your reaction and your thoughts of kind of this kind of spectrum that I'm defining. And again, I say I'm defining because I made the spectrum. These are very, very much the rules. The software producer rules are from the executive order. The ESP and CSP rules are very much from the DFARS. But you kind of have this interesting blurred line, because if you're a company that provides command and control software to manage satellites in outer space, and you provide the software, you're a traditional software provider, you're not really playing this FedRAMP or CMMC game at all, right? You're squarely in the SSDF category of, I built software, I gave you software, and I'm certifying that I built my software in a secure way. Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting take, because it comes down to whether that is commercial off-the-shelf software, proprietary, because, if the government is purchasing your software and you're developing it specifically for the government, under the DFARS, they have technical rights to the data. So when the government funds your development, they get rights to the data. And there's different types of rights. There's kind of unlimited rights, there's limited rights, and they're limited in different ways based on the contract and the contract officer negotiation, right? So if that data is proprietary to the company and it's commercial off the shelf, meaning you sell that to non-federal entities, the same version you would sell to the federal entity, it's subject to just the SSDF. Now, if the government has funded the development of that software, or if it's unique and specific to the government, those things will make that software covered under the DFARS and potentially be CUI the data, right? It gets more interesting if the data, then the software is also export controlled, if it manages encryption, right? So if it's an encryption software, it might also be controlled under the ITAR or EAR and have certain export control requirements, right? Now, if you deliver it through a cloud product, you've got a whole other issue, right? So this is a great map. And I think it's just, there's this underlying theme of who has rights to the data, right? And which regulatory authority applies, right? Because secure software development is an agency requirement, right? And CMMC is an agency requirement, and FedRAMP is an agency requirement. But like export controls, right? Those are just apply to you as an American. Like, it doesn't matter like whether the agency is purchasing it or not. If the data manages encryption at that level, it's export controlled, right? If it involves the command and control delivery of malware, right? It could be potentially a weapon. That's a USML item under the ITAR. That's export controlled. So there's these other facets that get put into this, right? That come down to contract rights. It comes down to, are they commercial? Are they open source? Are they export controlled, right? So all of that kind of like, it's just a really complex regulatory environment. And that's the challenge, is because I think that a lot of the companies that are doing this, they don't have the resources to get those opinions from consultants or law firms, and they don't have internal counsel to do it who are expert, right? Because there's a lot of things that come into this, right? Contract law, cybersecurity regulation, export control law, knowledge of how software is developed, right? What's the difference between application code and object code, and what is software? Is it a tangible medium of expression, which is the definition of software, right? What does that include? Application code? Is it only object code? Is it both, right? So I think that there's a lot that I hope I'm not getting overly detailed here, but there's so much to consider when you start to look at these individual use cases, or to your point, when they overlap.
Well, and that was the one that came to my mind from a conversation recently. I mentioned that command and control, it's a real life customer of Hunter's. They're, again, purely a software producer. And by the way, they're not yet selling this to the government. They're currently selling it to defense industrial base. So they don't even really need to do the SSDF thing at the moment, unless their agency requires that as part of their supply chain things in the contract. But that company that they sold it to is most certainly going to be having CUI on that environment. And then they're like, but wait, our software phone's home. Well, now I got some really interesting questions about, does that make you an ESP because it phones home? Well, it depends on how it phones home. Are you phoning in? If you're phoning in, maybe you're an ESP. If it phones home, it's got to be phoning home to FedRAMP moderate equivalent infrastructure. So
Right.
there's a lot of layers to this onion that get really interesting as people understand that you only build software, but you're hosting it in a way, and now the customer you sold it to put covered data on it,
Mm-hmm.
and then now it broke because what you sold was more of a framework than software, and someone's got to go in and fix it. And now all those responsibilities get super murky. So it's going to be an interesting journey for people trying to sell software, not just to the government, but as the government moves things like satellite and space operations to industry, where again, you're now into export controlled information, you're now into CUI, depending on what they're gathering and for whom and how their contract is structured, and any number of other pieces in that supply chain. So it definitely, to say the least, it's going to take a lot of people a lot of time to wrap their heads around it.
Another interesting thing you brought up is this ESP notion, right? Because in the DFAR 7012, which is the CUI clause, if you share the CUI, the covered defense information, with someone to deliver a performance under the contract, you're required to flow the clause down, which basically forces them to be compliant theoretically. But, in FedRAMP, like you have this concept of direct impact metadata, indirect impact metadata, right? Which is very sensibly included, right? If I give vulnerability information out about the systems, like that could potentially be allowing access. So the CMMC rule, actually, the proposed rule clarifies this and says that if you use an external service provider who has security metadata, and they don't define direct impact versus indirect impact, they just say if they have metadata, which is not well defined, logs, host names, usernames, and et cetera in the rule, which is a bad regulation, right? Et cetera is not good. That they also need to meet CMMC level 2, right? If you're CMMC level 2, but if it's in the cloud, right, they also probably have to beat FedRAMP, right? So it becomes this very interesting extension, because once you start to look at, it's your point, once the agencies are peeling back the onions, right, and it's just over time that they figure this out, there's just a lot of nuance there that needs to be addressed. And every time it gets addressed, it really increases the scope of the regulation and the owner and how onerous the requirement is. And so like this applies to external service providers, you're right. And if you create software and you're managing that back end to the software, let's say you sell software to the government, that government has rights to it as CUI data, your development environment. Well, how you manage patching, how you distribute, like what are the distro chains for your software, right? Is it using FIPS standards to hash and do checksums of that data? Is it using FIPS validated encryption to transmit the software? Are you managing vulnerabilities over FIPS validated communication channels? Are you securing vulnerability information? Like it really starts to change the game when you start to talk to software producers, right?
I was going to say, and even more fundamentally, and this gets to the technical challenges that this brings to these companies providing the software. Where do you host your source code? Is it on GitHub? Because if it's not in a certain version of GitHub, it's not FedRAMP moderate, and that is very much. Even calling that I understand it's metadata under the concept of what we're talking about, right. But even to think that the source code is metadata and not like the brain of the thing you're doing is kind of funny to me, but it very much is.
Good news for software producers. It is not CUI if it's lawfully in the public domain. Right. So open source, if you're using open source third-party libraries and software development kits, that's lawfully in the public domain. So it's not CUI, as long as it's lawfully there, as long as one didn't steal it and put it on GitHub, right? It's lawfully in the public domain. Now, it's not CUI, right? But where you're developing it and compiling it to create a new product, right? Which then has...
Where the company IP is now can very much be CUI.
Right.
Or at least metadata that has access to CUI and is therefore covered by CUI requirements.
Right. And so there's two things that matter here. Once that gets joined with something IP that the government owns, right, under the contract, it becomes CUI. And also if it becomes something that creates a military capability, potentially, that becomes ITAR. Right. And so you've got this intersection of once you start to merge code and write your own code and join it and create an application, that application can take on certain properties, whether through intellectual property rights or through its end use, right? As a USML, United States Munitions List, ITAR controlled. It could be controlled under the EAR, the Export Administration Regulations, the Commerce Control List as dual use technology. So the thing is, you have to create working definitions of what CUI is for you, what metadata is for you, because again, it's going to be important because the government doesn't really understand, right? They're just writing a contract and flowing down standard contract language. The companies need to create working definitions that are defensible and say, this environment is not a CUI environment. Our test environment, not CUI. Our dev, our prod, CUI, right? And so there's ways of doing that and creating those working definitions to effectively manage these regulatory requirements, because ultimately you're the expert, not the government. And once you get the CUI, you're also the authorized holder under the CUI rules. And so you get to make certain decisions about security that are afforded you, not in the contract, not in CMMC, not in FedRAMP, but in the original CUI executive order. It's important to read that and understand when you're authorizing alternative safeguards, when you're flowing down contract clauses, when you're defining system boundaries. That's your job. That's your responsibility. That's your authority. So that's why I tell companies, always get these working definitions going, make them defensible, build your cybersecurity controls around them, and go forth and prosper.
You actually that's a perfect segue, because that already answers half of what my next question was going to be, which is what strategic advice should we be telling these vendors to start off with? So having good definitions, understanding your responsibilities for your protections, those are two really good ones. I think one that I would add, and I'm curious what other ones you would have, is while you want to set a heavy balance of not just throwing everything in the high water mark, because that just gets unnecessarily expensive and restrictive on commercial non-government business, but also having a reasonable, a reasonably segmented pool that is high water mark, where you feel comfortable operating, your developers feel comfortable operating. I'm thinking like annual security training, all those other things that feed up to it, because I can assure you that most developers I work with know CUI is the thing that's on top of some documents that they get sometimes, right? They don't think about it in terms of code or schemas. And I can tell you from personal experience, I'm dealing with this with an Air Force contract right now, where it's an entirely unclassed program. There's some proprietary commercial information, because it's having to do with commercial air carriers giving safety data to the government. So that's not CUI, but it is commercial protected data that the government has agreed to protect. But then somebody came back and said, well, you can't have the schema to the database in your environment. It's CUI. And my thought first was, well, yeah, we can, because we're following CMMC and 801. Like, we absolutely have built our systems to support us having CUI. And so there's not even a good understanding on the government side is what when you have a thing, what does that mean you can do? And then I'm also going to come back and challenge what makes that data schema CUI. Not the data itself, fine. CUI, proprietary, commercial, whatever you want to call it, totally agree that needs to be protected. But like the column names, I don't. Have I seen schemas that are even classified in TSSCI? Absolutely, but they have a very clear derivative and explanation as to why the schema itself is sensitive. And in this case, again, we'll figure it out. It's a relatively new project to us, but I just don't think that that's true. I think that that's a misunderstanding of what protected metadata really should be, because that's not security metadata. That's informational metadata, and it's frankly very boring metadata. It's nothing that would have any strategic adversarial advantage to anybody.
Right. Yeah. I mean, so I think there's a few buckets that I would recommend. One is basic blocking and tackling, right? Know where your data is, where your systems are, keep that inventory up to date, automate that, right, as best you can. You've got vulnerability scan, you've got all these other things. Account for external system interconnections, so your cloud services, your DevOps pipelines, things like that. Account for your system dependencies, right? So you may have a system outside of your boundary that provides a security function. You may have a workflow ticket, like a ServiceNow ticketing system that provides access, right, to this environment. It's not in the environment. You need to account for that. So you need to account for your systems, your data, classify that data, right? And where there's a question on classification, read the regulations. And when it comes to federal agencies, talk to them, right? So if you have a contract with the DoD, this works. If you don't, you go to your prime. which is far more difficult. But under the CUI rules, the policies inside of DoD, if you read the CUI policies that DoD issues to DoD components, they're required to provide a senior agency official to adjudicate questions of CUI. Is something CUI, is it not? The contract officer may not know. DoD is required to provide that SAO. When the government says something is CUI, it doesn't necessarily make it CUI. It means the contract officer thinks it is. For it to be CUI, it needs to be classified as that under a dissemination authority, which is a statutory or regulatory authority that makes it CUI. So when you can ask for a security classification guide for the project, there's a lot of things you can ask for. And when there's something that's CUI, you want to make sure that it is and say, well, show me the dissemination authority. Under what authority are you classifying this as CUI, or why should I? And document that record, because there may just be a fundamental disagreement, but you want to document that and say, we've done our due diligence, we disagree, we're the authorized holder, so we've made this judgment call, right? And I think you have some opportunity there for negotiation, or at least to document your logic. And I think the other thing is, to your point on this metadata and all this other kind of data, just like I think of differential security, like segment your networks to high impact, medium impact, low impact, classify them however you want. CUI goes in medium impact, for instance. At the same time, like differential privacy, right? I can have a lot of data and I can present at the application layer data that's not controlled, right? So if I have a bunch of PII and I'm doing processing of this, I mean, DHS just came out with a CUI rule that addresses this and requires FedRAMP authors and moderate ATOs for these systems. And if I'm processing agency PII, right, I can represent that at the application layer as statistics, as information that may not be CUI, right? Because I'm not showing you the PII. So that concept of differential privacy can also be differential security, right? I can scrub and create a presentation of that data at the application layer that's not necessarily controlled, right? So that, to your point, like understanding these things is complex, but it's worth reading the regulations. It's worth reading your contracts. It's worth getting expert help, right, from a third party, Ankura, Hunter Strategy, a good law firm, and understanding what all this means, and then building your security posture around that. To your point, to minimize the cost of the controls, only implement where you need to, always implement good security. But if you're going to spend to do something that's specific to the contract, make sure that's a limited spend, right? And so I think those are the things you should be doing. And don't be afraid to interact with your prime and your agency contract officer. And the reason, and I'll say this kind of openly, it's not only to get an information, it is to document that you asked and they said they didn't know or weren't able to provide a reason. Right? Then you have a documented record that they couldn't tell me. So as the authorized holder, I made a decision with the best interest of U.S. national security at heart, and I made a decision to secure this data in such a way. And that provides a documentary record that you've acted in good faith. Because where companies are going to get in trouble with False Claims Act, with other things, right, is when they don't operate in good faith. Because the issue under the False Claims Act, right, so you said you implemented security, you got compromised, you weren't implementing security, you got the contract telling the government you implemented security, so you lied to the government. The standard is knowingly doing that. If you're operating in good faith, you're not going to be knowingly violating, right, your contract or regulatory requirements. So that documentary record is really important to ensure that you're not knowingly doing anything and you're documenting your good faith efforts to protect the national security equities of the United States.
So let's talk trends and future stuff. Given we've kind of seen this evolution, right? Where do we think this is going?
Yeah. So I think, after many years of saga, the CMMC is going to be done. There's two parts to that. There's the 32 CFR program rule. So that's a proposed rule. Comments are closed. It'll come back as an interim final rule or a final rule at some point. After that, the DoD will then make a contract rule. So the program will be done. And they'll say, this is the contract clause we're going to implement. How do you flow it down? How do you get it assessed? What are the specific contract language requirements? That'll be in 48 CFR. That'll take a year or so to go through the same process, proposed rule, interim final, or final rule. CMMC will be the law of the land. I think the FedRAMP thing is going to be hard-coded into CMMC. I don't think the memo will be because this came out after the proposed rule was issued. So I think the FedRAMP memo is going to be a backdoor because, as I said, 7012 is the center of mass for CUI protection. CMMC only validates it. So I think that you're going to need to present this body of evidence. This memo will be rolled in as incorporated by reference, right? That 3POs and CMMC assessors are going to say this is included by reference because it's part of the adequate security we're assessing. I think FedRAMP is going through modernization, right? I think FedRAMP is trying to expand its capabilities and because cloud adoption is only going to accelerate, right? I think that the secure software development framework is going to be, right now it's an attestation, the agency can request it. I think it'll be hard coded into the federal acquisition regulation. I think there will be more enhanced validation of that, because what CMMC shows and the CUI saga shows is self-attestation does not work. Companies don't understand. Companies aren't incentivized to be fully honest about that. I think the other thing that's going to happen is with the SSDF rule with the FAR, there's also a CUI rule with the FAR. So the DoD FAR, or the CUI rule for the DoD, was a stopgap because the federal acquisition regulation is supposed to contain a CUI requirement. So I think when that gets done, the CUI requirements are going to be passed on to every federal contractor in a contract similar to what DoD has. 800-171 will be a baseline. So if you're making ranger hats for the park ranger and you have a deal with the Interior Department and you get that park ranger's name, phone number, address, and hat size, you've got CUI. And the question will likely be answered in the rule that if you use a cloud provider, it'll need to be FedRAMP moderate. So these will get extended into all federal supply chains. DHS just issued a CUI rule that said they needed a moderate ATO for processing data for the DHS. And DHS said, we are deferring other contract requirements to the FAR rule because no other agency wants to go through what DoD went through, right? So you've got those are going to be heavily impactful, tying in CUI requirements, tying in FedRAMP, and tying in secure software development. And the other thing you're going to see is more intense regulation and oversight of artificial intelligence. Right. I think that right now, high performance computing assets are export controlled. But I think what you're going to see is generative AI models created on those assets are also going to be controlled, and their model weights and source code and things like that will be controlled. So I think there's going to be a lot more scrutiny. There was just a couple memos out that agencies are required to appoint AI officials. And there's just going to be a greater focus on that. And I think it's tricky because the way you secure HPC and AI environments, those systems aren't built for security controls. They're built to run high performance workloads. And it's going to be hard to implement FedRAMP or 800-171 on those systems. So there's going to be a delta between what the government expects for security and what industry can deliver. And I think those are the key trends right now is kind of how do you apply all of that, right? So the broader FAR CUI rule, how is FedRAMP incorporated into that? Secure software development as a contract requirement, and how all of the above applies to artificial intelligence.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think I had everything that you listed in your head except for AI, because I did not. I keep forgetting about how AI is going to get swept up in this, even though it's totally different and it really shouldn't be governed the same way. But we're not going to restart this process another way. We're going to use what we got. The government doesn't have any option. As difficult and as painful as that'll be, there is just no other option.
Yeah, I mean, this Federal Information Security Modernization Act, FISMA, and this was the first FISMA was early 2000s, right? And they've updated it. But it's very clear how information security is going to work in the government, right? It's under FISMA, and NIST is the authority, period, the end. There's no other way to evaluate security, to create standards, to create guidelines. That's it. So we know who's going to be writing the rules. We know how it's going to go. And there's just no way to turn the ship. And I think to your point, right, governing AI needs to be different. But when the AI falls under CUI rules, SSDF rules, cloud rules, you're going to get those rules. There's no other option. That's just how the thing works. And so you're going to have to bridge that delta between what you should be doing with AI and what the government's required to be doing with AI by its own statutory requirements. So I'm interested. We'll see what happens.
Yeah, I was going to say, interesting times to be around. Alex, thank you so much for being here this afternoon. This has been great. This has been wonderful.
Yeah, I had a great time. Thanks, guys. Thanks, Matt.